Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement strategies and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small. And we train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And if you want to create change in your community in 2023, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel daunting. And that's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help you when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases and wills and estates planning. And as Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with the experience that you can count on. And to find out more, just go to their website, which is mauriceblackburn.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters, and you need the tools that you can trust. The lists are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive those donations, events that will energize the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, visit their website, which is swiftfoxcrm.com, to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday, that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them both home and abroad. And we head across the ditch to New Zealand today to talk to my good friend Neale Jones. It was the New Zealand national elections on the same day as the referendum here in Australia on Saturday, the 14th of October. Unfortunately, the Labor Party over there didn't get returned back into government. They lost to National and Chris Luxon. But to help me unpack the results and basically do a bit of a campaign review, I guess, and more broader, a bit of a government review of Labor's time in office and where to from here, Neale and I are going to have a bit of a conversation about that. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the show, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. And when you're done listening, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Podchaser. And for all updates, follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I shouldn't say Twitter anymore. I should say X, shouldn't I? Must update that. Okay, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we are taping this one on a Tuesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And on Saturday the 14th of October, there was an election in the great nation of New Zealand at the same time as we were having our referendum on the voice to Parliament. Not a great day for the progressive side of politics, both here in Australia and across the ditch, because the result was a loss for the Labor government and saw a return to government for the Conservative Party, which in New Zealand is called National. To help me break that down, he's been on the show a number of times. You know him very well. He's a former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. He's now the Managing Director for Capital New Zealand Government Relations. And to help me recap this election campaign, Neale Jones, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
G'day, Stephen.
Now, I must preface this particular episode. We've done over the last feels like over the last 2 or 3 years, certainly for here in Australia, we've done a lot of post-election recaps where we've won. So it's just been like popping champagne and talking it up and loving life. Rarely have we had to do a post-election where we've lost. So I just need to preface this particular episode by saying that the intentions of this episode is to reflect with both respect and compassion, because when our comrades lose elections, particularly from government, folks lose jobs, people who put their heart and soul into an election campaign, and then to lose, it hurts. And we don't need left-wing podcasts pouring a bucket of shit on them after defeat. However, what we do want to do is we want to reflect on some of the lessons that possibly can be learned for our friends. going forward, and to stimulate conversation. And in particular, this podcast is listened to by a lot of friends in New Zealand. We've got a sizable audience in NZ, and we know that they've got sort of views and opinions. So we wanted to have we've done 3 or 4, you and I, episodes leading up to this particular election. So we just thought it'd be appropriate to not go silent after the loss, but actually to come back again and just have a bit of a chat about what did we take away from this campaign and this government, because they've been in for a while, and hopefully some of our reflections and in particular your reflections and your insights can help the party going forward. So with that, I want to kick off by talking about the results to start with, and what we can draw from those results. And for our Australian audiences that aren't familiar, Labor was reduced from 62 seats in the single cameral parliament, unicameral, I should say, parliament, down to 34. That was a loss of 31 seats. National went from 34 to 50. They picked up 17. The Greens actually picked up 4. They went from 9 to 14. And ACT, which is on that broad right coalition, picked up 1. New Zealand First picked up 8. And Te Party Māori picked up 2. Neale, were you surprised by the results?
Not really, because Labor had been quite far behind for most of the campaign. I was hoping that the last week or two of the campaign, where National really did pretty badly, might have just tipped it a bit more in Labor's favour. In fact, National did lose 5% between the advance vote of the last 2 weeks and the preliminary count on election day. So if you count up the advance votes, National got 41.5%. If you count up the votes cast on election day, they only got 36.5%. So there was a pretty catastrophic collapse at the very end of the campaign for National, but not enough to stop them forming government. But potentially, and there are still special votes to come, which 1 in 5 votes cast are a special vote, and that's overseas voters are some of them, but most are people who are out of the electorate on the day or who register on the day, and that tends to swing left. Typically 1 or 2 seats go to the left, so it's likely that National and ACT won't be able to govern alone, and they'll need the populist New Zealand First Party as part of their coalition. And what that means is that National and ACT, who have quite a flinty neoliberal view of the world, will find themselves constrained by New Zealand First, which is far more centrist in its economic policy, and they'll have a much more chaotic coalition, having 3 parties to wrangle. So not all bad news on election night.
No, Winston Peters, that constant kingmaker of New Zealand politics, rises again. It's incredible. I mean, when someone writes a book about his career, it's going to be a fascinating read.
Well, it's the second time his party's been turfed out and they've come back in, which is remarkable under our system. They're the only party who've managed to do that, and they've done it twice. I was going to say the other thing that was surprising on election night was how Labor didn't pick up National's decline in the final days. It seemed through the campaign that no matter how much Labor threw at National, you could drag their vote down, but it wasn't going back to Labor. And I think that kind of speaks to some of the challenge Labor had, where a lot of the voting base had just become frustrated or alienated through the cost of living crisis and had abandoned Labor. And no matter what Labor did, just weren't coming back.
Yeah, that's an interesting reflection. So let's. I want to dive into that in a moment. Let's talk about that. But before we do that, I think it's worthwhile for those that hadn't been paying attention to New Zealand electoral politics, or just New Zealand politics in general, to set the scene. And I just want to go back to the start of the year, because there was a seismic shift in the political landscape when then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern shocked New Zealand politics and decided to retire from politics in total. In hindsight, I'm wondering, if you think about the foundations for a successful campaign, and I frame this question not in a sort of, I'm not having a pot shot at Jacinda. I mean, she's well in her right to say, what, I'm tapping them out, I've had enough. But from looking at it through the lens of getting ready for a campaign, did that catch the party on the hop a little bit in a year that you're about to start to prepare for the election, and you've got your lead at the top of the ticket, and off you go, you got your policy set, and let's just do this?
Look, undoubtedly, when the Prime Minister resigns at the end of January in election year, that does disrupt things a bit. But look, I think people understood the reasons, and the reality was, while Jacinda Ardern was a very consequential Prime Minister of New Zealand, and while she had been incredibly popular, getting that 50%, that first ever parliamentary majority under MMP in 2020, post COVID, there had been quite a shift in public perceptions of Jacinda Ardern. Her personal popularity and the party's popularity had been declining for some time. There's a certain level of sort of misogynistic and conspiracy-driven toxicity around Jacinda Ardern. I think I spoke on this show previously about how whenever she went out in public, there were people, conspiracy theorists threatening her, chasing after her, screaming at her, putting up posters threatening to kill her. It was pretty ugly. And I think she correctly identified that the best way for Labour to have a chance was for her to step out of the scene and let someone else have a go. And to be honest, when it first happened, that most people's thought was, oh, well, Jacinda's gone, we're stuffed. But Chris Hipkins very quickly managed to pivot. The caucus was remarkably unified in the way they transitioned to a new leader. And Hipkins very quickly cleared away some of the policy programs that were being undertaken by the Ardern government that were not necessarily unpopular, but were seen by voters to be sort of distractions when they were concerned about cost of living. These are things like the TVNZ Radio New Zealand merger or the sustainable biofuels mandate. They were a series of issues that sort of Chris Hipkins said, look, these aren't priorities now. And he cast himself as kind of a non-flashy, workman-like guy who was from the working class suburb of Upper Hutt, who liked a sausage roll and a meat pie, and was focused on cost of living and focused on bread and butter issues. And that was what the public wanted to hear. And he immediately Labour's vote shot from the low 30s up to 38%. His preferred Prime Minister coming in was very high. And people thought, there was a view there that Labour was back in the box seat to win the election when previously they'd been written off. So I think, yes, it was a shock, but I think that transition in those early stages put Labour in a good position for the election.
You described a scenario there, and as I was listening to you say that, I could have replaced the words Jacinda Ardern with Daniel Andrews, and I'm reticent to always compare everything to Daniel Andrews because in some ways he is a political phoenix. Not a phoenix, a unicorn. Wrong mythology. But locked up Victorians more than any other jurisdiction in the world during COVID was constantly threatened by crackpot cookers. Like literally had a member of the Victorian Parliament get up in front of a rally at Flinders Street Station and call on people to shoot him in the head.
Wow.
Like this is insane kind of shit, right? Cookers running against him in his local seat and just getting a lot of their crazy conspiracies on the main news items of mainstream television each night. All this is going on, and yet Labor returns with a swing to a increased majority in the House, the lower house. So it also with a strong issue around cost of living as well. Like that was the major current running through the 2023. What year is this? It was last year, 2022. All these years are all blurring. 2022 election, right? Cost of living was this central issue for that campaign, yet Labor won. Now, you can push back and say, well, you're comparing apples and oranges here because that's New Zealand, this is Victoria. But I'm just wondering, it is possible to be in that scenario and still come in. Now, Labor's polls never sunk to the level they did in New Zealand. Why did they sink to that point? Because you said that they were low 30s to get up to 38. It's still not enough, though, is it, to get back in the hunt, right?
I mean, look, it's possible that for a state government, you don't catch the blame for inflation as much as a central government does. New Zealand has we don't have a federal system. We have a unitary government, and so I think there's no blaming the federal government here. Labor caught the whole blame for it. Look, the reality is the right track, wrong track from about 2021 started going down. Jacinda Ardern and Labor went down. And that was cost of living. Inflation was over 6%. Interest rates were steadily rising by the time of the campaign. Floating rates were at 8%. And, petrol prices, prices at the supermarket, that people were really struggling. And I think you add to that, some of the hangovers from COVID. So there was some, Aucklanders tell me that there is still some residual anger about the second lockdown in Auckland, how long it went on. Now, you can argue, as I would, about, the trade-offs there and how 20,000 lives were saved and how that was probably necessary. But there was anger about that. And there were some flow-on effects, kids who were disengaged from education, some crimes that had emerged with young people, ongoing issues with the health system. So there was an environment where there was quite a lot of challenges that any government would have struggled in. And maybe in terms of cost of living, Labor could have owned that. There was an argument back when Hipkins polls rose early on, when you refocused on cost of living, that you could make an argument to say, which party are you going to trust in a cost of living crisis? Labor, which has always stood for working families, or National, which stands for the wealthy? I don't know whether Labor could have really credibly addressed cost of living, but I do think the public didn't believe they had.
Why not, though? Can I push you on that one, Neale? Why don't you think they could have credibly done that?
Sorry, I said I don't know if they could have credibly done it. It's possible that no matter what you throw at it, unless you massively go into debt and probably risk stoking inflation by giving big tax cuts and transfers, you're not going to be able to address a 6% annual cost of living increase. That is, the government was taking 25 cents a litre off petrol for a while. That was ruinously expensive. So, I mean, it would have taken quite a lift from government, I think, to credibly address it. I think the challenge is they didn't. So you probably needed to throw the kitchen sink at it, and I don't think Labor did that. I think that for far too long in election year, people were waiting. They liked what Chris Hipkins said about cost of living, and they were waiting. And the budget came, there wasn't really anything tangible there for people. And then by the time of the campaign, they sort of released what were a very good social democratic set of policies, like 4 weeks of parental leave and extending early childhood education subsidies and free prescriptions and policies like that. But I don't think people looked at it and said, that's what I need to ease pressure at the pump or at the checkout and to feed my family. I think its tax cut policy was utterly discredited and broken by the campaign, but they had quite a simple message, which was, we're offering you tax relief. I think Labor had quite a complicated set of policies that were only tangentially related to cost of living, and I don't think people ultimately believe Labor could address it. But the reason I give some caution is I don't want to sit here in hindsight and say, well, it was easy, because these things are really hard, and even if Labor played a blinder in those economic conditions, it may not have been enough. I do think there's a case to be made. The election was lost before Chris Hipkins took over.
How much do we credit the rise of Chris Luxon and National in terms of them getting their shit together?
Yeah. Look, definitely, I think Chris Luxon becoming leader of National and National becoming a disciplined and focused opposition was hugely determinative. And Luxon immediately rose in the polls. Look, when you're a former CEO and people have got economic concerns, that tends to be a good recipe in politics. People think CEOs understand money and budgets, and so must have the answers. I think National as well, he managed to get the caucus disciplined. Success often does that. But you saw an end to that backbiting and infighting that had plagued National for years. But I think critically, they really focused on a couple of key issues, and they were relentlessly on message. So, you ask anyone what National's story was, they'd say Labor has spent too much money and they've stoked inflation and they've let crime get out of control. And National's going to give you tax cuts, rein in government spending, and crack down on crime. And that was a very simple message, and it really cut through to people. And they didn't get distracted. They had quite a sparse policy manifesto. They really didn't go into it. There were many areas they didn't even announce policy on. They targeted where are the issues people are hurting and attacked the government relentlessly and came up with quite flimsy but popular policies to address it.
I mean, it's such a key learning, isn't it, in any political campaign? Like in 2019, Labor had, 100 new policies or some shit like that. I mean, just like,
Mm.
yeah, I'm a simple person. I'm not that bright. I think voters are so busy that they haven't got time for all the nuances in a campaign. They just give me this, just give me the straight up, give me the cliff notes. Just give us the top line about what I need to know before I go on to vote. And if there are three things, then if I can remember that and I like that, then I'll vote for it. Right?
Yeah, look, well, I mean, one of the lessons I learned from when I worked for Labor in opposition was the more you say, the less people hear. You've got to keep it really simple and focused.
There was, I mean, I actually want to raise this question as well about being focused. I know that there was a loss of several Labor ministers leading up to the poll. I just wonder, is that internal beltway shit that no one even knew about and cared about, or did that have an impact in voterland?
I think, look, if it had been one or two ministers, I think you might have said, oh, it's pretty beltway, but Hipkins was relatively new in the job. People were giving the benefit of the doubt. They thought he was competent from his time as a minister, which he is. And then he had, over a period of a couple of months, he had four ministers go. One sacked for leaking cabinet information to his donors, one for jumping political parties with no explanation, one for not disclosing shares in a company they regulated, and one who crashed into the back of a parked car and was charged with reckless driving and failing to accompany a police officer. That was the Justice Minister. So, when that happens, it does cut through. And I think if you look at the two areas during the year the polling collapsed, one of them was the budget, when people felt Labor hadn't really addressed cost of living in May. And then through June, July, when this was happening, these ministers were being lost, shall we say. The polls declined again. And I think it really did hit Hipkins and Labor's credibility, because Chris Hipkins was this new broom. He was this new guy in charge of Labor. Things were going to be different. He was getting rid of the stuff he didn't like. He was doing things he did like. And then when all that happens, people kind of go, hang on, this is the same stuff I didn't like before. You're just the same crowd that I'd already given up on, and you can't control them. And I think that probably hurt his leadership and his credibility with the voters at a critical time.
It's that moment in political campaigns that I know that I've been on both sides of when it's happened. In 2007, in the Rudd election year, there was just things that weren't going right for the Howard government, and you were like, I think we're going to win, because it's just those little annoying things that you're like, oh, we just can't catch a break. And it was happening to Howard. And I remember that used to happen to us all the time, but we never, ever got a break. And I know that if you were national watching that, you'd be going, oh my God, this is just unraveling on the other side. Like, they're already behind. They don't need these type of things happening consistently. And the litany that you just went through there would be enough for you to go, this is just like, it's, even if you're like if you're a person of faith or not, but you'd be thinking, oh my God, the gods of politics are on our side right now because of the things that's happening to your opponent, right?
Yeah, look, when I woke up one morning to news that the Justice Minister was facing charges, I kind of thought that's the end. I don't know how you recover from that. That feels like a footnote to an end note to the government.
Yeah, it's to quote John Armitage, who's been on our show before. It's when that happens, it's brutal. Yeah. It's just brutal for you, right?
Yeah, and it is annoying because none of these things are policy issues. None of these things are, none of these things are things that voters should look at and say, well, that's going to make my life better or worse. But it does speak to competence and capability, and voters do care about that. That is increasingly important for voters, particularly in New Zealand.
Yeah. We talked about policy before. I just want to reflect on the policies that Labor took to this particular poll and compare them to national, because you said that national were very good at getting it down to a couple of 3 or 4 key areas. And we talked before about the cost of living as being central to this particular campaign. Did Labor have enough in the tank to address this issue? Well, I mean, the things that you mentioned a bunch of things that they did do. Yeah. And historically, like Labor parties have always, in the eyes of the voter, when you talk, if you were to sort of say, what are your party strengths and policies, what are your party weaknesses and policies, cost of living historically has been bad for Labor. Jobs, health, education, public transport, infrastructure, good, generally speaking, good for Labor. The economy, cost of living, bad. But something that Albo did in the national election last year, and then Andrews in Victoria, was able to take cost of living and use it as a positive for Labor and frame it in such a way. And I saw things that were coming out from the Hipkins government that I thought were going in that direction to say, hey, look, we are actually tangibly addressing cost of living, and not through tax cuts, but through other ways that we can actually get money in your pocket straight away. What happened there?
I mean, I would just say Albo had a bit easier because he was trying to get into government on cost of living. And I remember seeing an ad that he had done about the price of a lettuce or something. I can't remember the exact ad, but I remember seeing it and going, you could use that exact ad against Labor in New Zealand, and it would be devastating. So, I think if the tide was turned and it was the New Zealand Labor Party trying to win this election, they would have found cost of living to be to their advantage. Look, I do think one of the challenges Labor had was that there wasn't a lot of money to go around. So they got to election year and the books were very, very tight. So there wasn't much room to spend without new revenue. And because inflation was high, there was a risk that any money you do spend on addressing cost of living ends up stoking inflation. So, for example, National has put out some reasonably large tax cuts, which all of the advice is will end up probably prolonging inflation. And so that's also a thing to consider. One of the challenges Labor had was there was a proposal that Grant Robertson and David Parker worked on for a wealth tax, which would have, I think, done a 0.5% tax on wealth over about $1 million or $2 million, and would have led to a $20 a week tax cut for every taxpayer. Something like that. There's a debate in Labor. Should they have done that? Chris Hipkins ruled it out. Some in Labor say that was a great missed opportunity. And that could have shown a real difference from National, really helped workers, with a decent equitable tax cut and showing whose side they were on. Others argue it would have just ended up Labor being bogged down by arguments from the economic establishment about this novel tax they were proposing. But that debate will be ongoing. I do think, though, the lack of new revenue and the lack of money in the budget meant Labor was quite constrained in what it could do, and that ended up having a relatively mild election policy offering, which I think didn't inspire voters. Having said that, I think the election, I mean, the voting, the Labor's vote basically collapsed late August, early September into the late 20s, and that was before most of the policies were announced. So by the time the policy platform was announced, I'd say the election was probably lost. And I think probably being more focused on money in your pocket earlier on might have made a difference. I think quite often we end up over-targeting, and we say if you've got 2 kids and you're and you're a veteran and you've got a disability, get this, and if you've got it's all very targeted and no one really knows what they're going to get. And I do think a simpler kind of here is some money targeted at low and middle income earners might have been more effective. But again, I don't want to pretend that would have been the answer. I don't think that could have happened, and we may have no different outcome. It did feel through the election year that just everything was against Labor, and the mood had turned against Labor, and that people weren't really listening. So, I'm really cautious not to sit here and in hindsight say you should have done this one simple thing and it would have won you the election.
Oh, I mean, this is the ultimate Monday quarterback podcast, obviously, so we need to acknowledge that. To that point, though, is there value in making some of those announcements that would go to addressing the cost of living, making them earlier, like substantially earlier?
Yeah, look, I think the budget in May was probably the time Labor needed to do a really substantive cost of living package. And that not happening probably meant that they went into the second half of the year without a credible story on cost of living. And I think that probably hurt them.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energize the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. And even if you can maybe pull back even more on that, then the idea of using the resources and the trappings of government through the cycle of a government in addressing the needs of an electorate. I'm talking years out. I know you've got 3-year terms, and there's an argument, I think, broadly speaking, that we all should have at least 4-year terms. I think 3 years is just ridiculous to try and effectively govern, right? Same issue here in Australia. We once had a referendum to amend it in our constitution so there'd be fixed 4-year terms, and the Australian public voted no. There you go. So I don't know how you can change it in your setup, but
it's always talked about, but never happens.
Oh, I know. Anyway, so I'm interested in getting from some reflections from you about how the government sought to use its time in office away from the election, year to implement good public policy to address the issues that folks in New Zealand are experiencing, and how that went through in the delivery of that and with the public service and the like.
Well, look, I do want to say, I mean, this government did make some really good achievements. So 77,000 kids were out of poverty under this government. Now, it's in a population of 5 million. So think about, a quarter or a fifth the size of Australia.
That's a lot.
So 77,000 kids out of poverty. 200,000 houses were built into this government. It's 1 in 10 houses in New Zealand were built under the Ardern government, Ardern Hipkins government. Record number of state houses, biggest build since the 1950s. Climate emissions have dropped for the last 3 years. Workers got fair pay agreements, the first sort of industry bargaining we've seen in decades. Well, they got it, but it wasn't through in time for it to actually have an effect. So there were some pretty substantive achievements. Low-paid workers had some of the biggest increases ever. Huge, big increases of beneficiaries. So I think there was a lot to be proud of, and Labor did deliver a lot. One of the challenges they had, of course, as well was the COVID-19 pandemic. They were in power for sort of two or 3 years, sort of 2 years. This pandemic came along, that took out a chunk, and then they had sort of a year and a half out the back of that to make a difference. So I want to be a bit easy on them there, but I do think there was a challenge at times with getting things through the public service. I think some of that was policy that probably was designed in opposition and probably wasn't, in hindsight, particularly good, such as Kiwi Build, which just wasn't a good policy, and Labor held on for far too long. But I think also there are areas where Labor does have to think for next time, how do we get things through? And one of them is light rail. The first announcement Jacinda Ardern made in 2017 was light rail from Auckland CBD to the airport and to Mount Roskill within 4 years. Well, we're 6 years on and not a single inch of track is laid. They haven't got a contract. No one knows what the route is or what the stops are. The public look at that and they say, how have you got nowhere? Similarly with mental health, they've had to build a new system. They've made some gains, things like the Access and Choice program, which offers free counselling, is happening. But years on, there's questions about why has that money not been done? Why is there not a single more acute bed? So I think there are some real challenges on delivery, and ministers, or Labor in hindsight needs to think about what could we have done to push the public service along and get things done. Because that became something that dogged Labor. Sort of Labor can't deliver became a real meme, and it was something that Christopher Luxon said in nearly every interview, and people believed. And while it wasn't fair, because Labor did deliver a lot, including a world-leading COVID response, there were some really high-profile examples that I think undermined the government's record. I think also there were some areas where the government, I think, misunderstood how you make enduring change. The view tended to be that we'll get all the stakeholders around together, get them all to agree on an issue, and then we'll make the change, and that will survive through future governments. And that may have worked with the Zero Carbon Bill, now the Zero Carbon Act, but there are lots of areas where it didn't. Fair pay agreements, rights for contractors, agricultural emissions pricing, income insurance. These are all areas where at the last minute, business and agricultural interests pulled out and started attacking it, and years were wasted. And my view is that the way you make enduring change is you get change through, you make sure it works and is effective, and you make sure there's a constituency behind it so that it's popular enough that the next government can't unwind it. And Labor did that last time with working for families, and John Key came in, having been very critical of it. He called it communism by stealth. And so this was, transfer payments to families and on low incomes. And actually, he came in, didn't get rid of it. And the classic example is Thatcher in the NHS. Thatcher famously didn't undermine the NHS, and the reason wasn't because Margaret Thatcher ideologically loved socialised healthcare. It was because she knew it was popular and she couldn't touch it.
Yeah.
And I think I look to fair pay agreements, and I can't. It kind of angers me, to be honest, that this was such an important thing for working New Zealanders, so core to Labour's agenda, and it was, instead of bashing it through in the first 3 months, it went through official papers and reviews and working groups, to the point that it came in so late that not a single one will be signed before National repeals it. And that, to me, is a lesson in the need for speed and for effectiveness in getting public buy-in. Because if you had bus drivers, cleaners, supermarket workers, dairy workers, security guards, major sectors all covered by fair pay agreements, which are, for Aussies, they're similar to modern awards, you've then got a constituency who have something to lose and who will fight to protect it.
It's a really important reflection you've made there, Neale, and it's something that we're talking to some union friends in New Zealand were remarking to me about how they've been negotiating with the government or with the department and one of them was, I think it was a particular sector that was covering 65,000 care and support workers across aged care, disability and mental health. And they're still seeking the wage claim up until election day. And, I have the words of Daniel Andrews on my head saying, having ongoing negotiations with workers in an election year in a sector that is Labor's bread and butter is unforgivable. And I just wonder about what kind of relationship government has with, let's talk about the union movement. What kind of relationship does the government have with the union movement? I know the union movement, for Australian listeners, there aren't as many unions affiliated to the Labor Party in New Zealand as there are in Australia. Some of the bigger ones, particularly nurses and teachers, are outside of the party, but they are in Australia as well. The nurses aren't affiliated to the Labor Party, nor are the teachers. The nurses in Victoria are a hugely important stakeholder for Labor governments and have been over the last 10 years of this particular Labor government. The ANMF, great allies, but they've got a great relationship with the government, and I think that they've worked at that. Is there a need, let's think forward, maybe reflect on what's happened in the past, but think forward, is there a need for the parliamentary wing of the Labor Party to start to go back and reset the relationships with both affiliated unions and with non-affiliated unions, so that when it comes election time, those members are out there doing the right thing by the party and by themselves?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think when it comes to the affiliated unions, there is a pretty good relationship generally, and they work hard to help support a Labor government. They donate, they get out there, they knock on doors, they host phone banks, they do all of that. I think there is some frustration at the slowness of delivery. I mean, fair pay agreements, obviously, the care and support workers agreement we discussed just now. The CTU this campaign actually ran a strong campaign, which had a real impact on the election. But I think generally with the non-affiliated unions, and particularly the public sector unions, there is a real disconnect between the Labor Party in government and those unions. And look, you can probably criticise both sides. I think there were times that some public sector unions probably thought that their job was just to go out and fight industrial claims against Labor for their members and fight harder against Labor than they would against National because the door's open. And often those took quite a negative tone, and no real sense of what had been gained, but only what hadn't been given. Similarly, I think Labor at times failed to reach out to some of those unions, failed to build those relationships, failed to work together on what a long-term plan looks like. So, look, I'm not going to cast blame on either side, but I think for the broader movement, I think one of the tragedies is you had a government this time that gave some of the biggest pay rises in New Zealand history to nurses and teachers. Still not saying that the pay is there where it should be, but significant pay increases. And voters went to the polls thinking Labor had failed to pay nurses or teachers properly. In fact, when I said to people, you know what, there have actually been some record pay increases for nurses, they just didn't believe me. They thought I was lying because that story hadn't been told. And I think they need to find a much better way of working together in the future.
Going to that story, how that story needs to be told, and more broadly with, let's go beyond just our traditional most important stakeholder, which is trade unions. Let's expand that out a bit further and just talk about stakeholder engagement. An area of the campaign that I have historically never paid any attention to, and it wasn't until the 2018 Victorian State campaign that there was 4 people who sat in the corner of CHQ, and some of them were my friends that I've known for a long, long time. And I wandered over and said, "What do you guys do? What do you guys do?" And they went, "Oh, we do stakeholder relationship." "Oh, really? Well, what's your day like?" And they walked me through it. These guys are phenomenal. The work that they do in a campaign is critical because it's the when the leader stands up and does a press stop, there are members of that stakeholder community standing with them. When they want to get some lines out, they're going to get Betty the nurse or Jimmy the plumber or whatever it might be. That particular someone from that stakeholder community giving lines to the media. It's that sort of third party endorsement. So there's some manifestation of good work over the life of a government in which you can deliver an election campaign. This stakeholder team were doing a phenomenal piece of work. But even going back further than that, the work that the government does in terms of building those relationships with these key stakeholders, I'm talking about industry groups, I'm talking about civic groups, community organisations, and obviously trade unions and business associations. Having that relationship and working at that relationship, developing that policy, and then delivering those policies, and then having those people go and talk to their audiences is such an important bit of work in terms of government, right? Something I'd never really paid much attention to. One thing I noticed during this campaign, I saw Chris Hipkins constantly doing media events on his own and not having people around him. And I just wondered what kind of what work or what strategy what work was being done behind the scenes from I guess it's the parliamentary team, right, to ensure that when a minister goes up and announces a policy, there are stakeholders with them, or when the top guy is doing an announcement, he's not there standing in front of a Labor hoarding on his own. It just looks shit.
Yeah, look, I mean, I can't speak to how the campaign managed it, but certainly my experience over the last at least 3 years of government, possibly 6, is Labor government tended to see stakeholder relationships as an afterthought, if at all, and I think that was probably quite damaging in the long term. I think people were often surprised by things that came out, even things that were positive, let alone things that were negative. I think often they felt they weren't listened to. I think a lot of the time ministers sort of thought, well, I've got my official briefings. I know all there is to know on an issue. I'll make my policy announcement and off I go. And then seemed sort of baffled why everyone was angry at them. Look, I'm not saying it's simple, but I do think a far greater focus on stakeholder relations is needed. Even when there's bad news, if you can ring someone the night before and say, hey, look, this is coming. This is what it means. This is why we're doing it. Can I talk you through it? You can even take the sting out of an attack.
Hell yeah.
If you've got good news, your stakeholders shouldn't find out because a press release comes through their inbox or a journalist calls them. They should be ready to go. And I just think that didn't really happen through the life of this government, and at least in my experience. And I think that's something that in opposition is going to be critical, because in opposition, many of your stories when you're attacking a government come from stakeholder allies. They're the ones who bring you problems. And so I think that's something Labor has to really focus on over the next few years.
Just can't underestimate the power of narrative, and narrative coming from not politicians, but from ordinary punters that look like you, or not like you and me, but look like
Certainly in opposition, some of the best stories we ever didn't even have Labor's name on them. We gave them to a journalist, and stakeholder allies ran the attack on the government.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the future. I want to talk about where the party goes next. Does Chris Hipkins remain as leader? And actually, for our non-New Zealand audience, you might want to just give a bit of explanation about how what the process is after Labor goes back into opposition in terms of how they deal with the leadership. It's actually quite unique, and I think it's an interesting thing that's worth sharing.
Yeah. So in the New Zealand Labor Party, under our constitution, within 3 months of a general election, the leader has to undergo a confirmation vote among the caucus, and if they lose that, unless it goes to a leadership race, if there's more than one candidate and one doesn't have a predominant support, it goes out to a broader party electoral college, which involves several months of a roadshow around the country of leadership contenders, an electoral college made up of members, caucus members, and union affiliate members voting on it. Chris Hipkins, yeah, he didn't resign on election night, which I thought was a good thing. Helen Clark resigned in 2008 on election night when she lost, and that meant Phil Goff came in, didn't get a honeymoon because everyone was talking about the new government, and there wasn't really a chance for the party to sort of talk about what next. So I think Chris Hipkins did the right thing not to resign. He hasn't made his intentions clear yet, whether he wants to move on, whether he wants to stay for a period and have a transition, whether he wants to try and fight 2026. He just hasn't said anything yet. I imagine once the special votes are counted and we know who the caucus is, we'll have a bit. He might start to firm up those decisions. He certainly has to start hiring staff soon for opposition if he's going to. So, there is some urgency there. I think one of the challenges Labor has is they don't have any obvious alternative contender. I think if Michael Wood or Kelly Allen were seen as possible future leaders, they both ended up being two of the four ministers who got themselves in trouble and both found themselves out of Parliament. Kelly Allen decided not to stand. Michael Wood lost his seat. And so there's really no clear alternative right now. I think the general view is the best thing is for Chris Hipkins to at least stay for a period, allow the dust to settle, get that election review underway, start to do some sort of thinking about where next. And then once the dust is settled, if someone else if he decides to move on or someone else wants to have a go, then do that. And Labor can start to think maybe in a year or so about what its policy platform looks like. But actually the challenge now is not to have some kind of fratricidal war about a wealth tax or or return to the days of undermining and untidiness that dogged Labor for so long. Right now, there's actually an urgent job Labor has to do, and I think a responsibility, which is National and ACT have some pretty extreme policies. National has a 100-day plan, which involves repealing fair pay agreements, restoring 90-day trials, which allow sacking for no reason. They want to reduce the amount of money beneficiaries get. They want to repeal a whole lot of labor legislation. They want to give tax cuts, which will be funded by slashing public servants, cutting benefits, selling homes to foreigners. I think there's actually a moment where Labor has to defend the people who it represents and do a good job at that, and has to start to chip away at the new government's credibility, and not at this critical time be self-indulgent and decide to fight each other. That the time will come to have those arguments about the future of the party, but I think let's just give 3 to 6 months of getting into opposition and then try and have an orderly discussion about what we do next.
Is there a need for renewal in the caucus? Obviously, a lot of people would have lost their seats in the aftermath of the election result. But the types of people that did lose their seats, are they folks that had been in there a while? Did a lot of younger MPs that had been elected, did they manage to hold on? What does the makeup of the caucus look like now?
Look, there's a bit of a mix of who lost, because Labor basically lost half its seats, so it lost some up and coming future talent. It lost some experienced people actually who were lowly ranked and lost their seats. I think the challenge Labor has now is to think about what does it need in the short term in terms of its mix of experience and new talent, and then how does it bring people through who are going to be ministers in the next government. And so I think the question now is, among MPs who have been around for a while, are they going to be part of the next government? And if they're not, is it time to start thinking about moving on so some fresh faces can come in and get some experience? The risk, of course, is if none of them do, you don't get that new talent in. But if all your experienced people leave, you end up with a caucus who don't have that institutional knowledge and experience in opposition. So I think they're going to have to handle it very carefully. I think one of the challenges Labor faces is a lot of their MPs, even relatively senior MPs, have never been in opposition before. So, you have very good people who have even served as ministers, but Jan Tinetti and Aisha Verrill, for example, who were ministers of health and education, very talented ministers, but have never been in opposition. So, a lot of them have got they're going to have to learn the craft of opposition, and they're going to have to learn it pretty quickly. And that's where that experience will help.
Yeah. One thing I've always been it's always struck me remarkably anyway has been that the infrastructure of the New Zealand Labor Party as a campaign operation has always been really, really good. You can tell because we steal all of your good data, people, when we need election campaigns, right? So there's always been good people coming through or leading the campaigns. And I want to tip my hat to both Rob Salmon and Hayden Monroe as well, who have been there through good times and obviously challenging times as well. Do we see new generation of younger people coming into the mix as well in the non-political side, like the administrative side and the campaign side of the party as well?
Yeah, there were some really good campaign managers and field organisers this time, and I mean, it was one of the problems is when you lose a campaign, everything's negative. It's all about what you did wrong, and if you win the campaign, all sins are forgiven. But the reality is, Labor ran a really good campaign. I mean, the number of person-to-person conversations nearly doubled from 2020. Fundraising was even higher than 2020. Wasn't high enough, but it was higher. I think we ran a really good campaign. I mean, the problem you've got is when you have a swing that badly against your party, we know that campaigns on the ground make a big difference when it's close. When you've got a close election, a good campaign will win you an election. When you're 20 points behind or 15 points behind, it can't get you there. And you're knocking on doors and people are saying, yeah, well, I hear what you're saying, but cost of living's high. I can't afford my groceries. Go away, and that's hard. But I think Labor ran a good field campaign. I think Hayden, as always, did an excellent job, and so did Rob. So I think we've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater there.
Which is always, to your point, it's always a challenge, right? Because we all run around going, "Oh, that's got to go," or "That's got to go," and it's to your point, it's never the answer. Clearly,
the reality is, if Labor had somehow pulled off a miracle and won this election, the conversation we just had would be very different. I'd be talking about the masterful things Labor did that won them the election. And I have this reflection actually after 2017 where I was asked after that election to go and present to a whole lot of people about Labor's brilliant strategy to win the 2017 election. And I started off by saying, had Jacinda Ardern not taken over 7 weeks before and set everything alight, I wouldn't be invited to speak here. And and people would say Neale Jones, that guy who was in charge, who was chief of staff in that loser election where Labor got trashed. But I said, instead, I'm telling you all the brilliant things we did.
Yeah, exactly. And even I think about in election campaigns, if one particular element of a campaign didn't land as well as it normally does, we don't then just go around and say, well, we're never going to do that again. Like if the policies weren't great, no one's going around saying, policies, we're never going to release any more policies anymore, right? Like it's just like what worked, what do we hold on to, and what can we make better into the future? Exactly. And obviously the party will go through that whole process in the coming weeks and months. Final reflections, Neale. I just want to sort of, hear your reflections on what the government actually did achieve over the years that they were in power in that oddly shaped building in Wellington that you all call the Beehive.
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, I mean, there are significant achievements on child poverty, on climate change, on housing, on those core issues Labor campaigned on, and which people will try to say to this day they did not achieve, but the numbers don't lie. But I think also, one of the things that there's a lot of revisionism about at the moment is the COVID response. And you hear people saying, oh, Labor, they would the lockdowns in hindsight, they weren't justified, or they were too strong, or they should have been looser and all this. And MIQ, which was our the hotels, the managed isolation as people came into the country, that was terrible and miserable. And look, there are lots of things in hindsight you can look at and say that should have been done better. But I know from people, close to me who were working on that, they were making decisions with often very limited information, very uncertain information, often with very limited time, and they had to make the best they could in those circumstances. And the reality is the studies show 20,000 people are alive today who would not have been alive otherwise. And I speak to people in other countries who talk about friends and family members who died from COVID, and we haven't had that level of death in New Zealand, and fortunately, but also unfortunately for in terms of our discussion, if you don't know that one of those 20,000 could have been your father or your brother or your best friend, You don't know. If someone said to you, you just have to stay inside for a few months and your father gets to live, that seems like a very easy price to pay. But when you don't know who those 20,000 people are, it feels in hindsight like a terrible, unjustifiable restriction on your freedoms. And I just think sometimes we lack perspective on that. And we also expect a level of perfection in hindsight, all the information we have now. But I think the government can hold its head high and say, at a time of national crisis, it managed to get New Zealand's economy through, avoid mass unemployment, and save 20,000 lives. And I think that's a legacy to be really proud of.
I think everyone who has that view or is sort of recasting the narrative of COVID needs to go watch that film Contagion again and actually just remind us of exactly how bad it could have got. Like, you watch that and go, man, we really dodged a bullet there because that kind of got out of hand. It's remarkable that what happened. I still look back on the experience that we all had in terms of COVID and it, particularly here in Australia and New Zealand, and think, my God, thank God it wasn't like Italy. Or thank God it wasn't like places like New York, because we were so lucky. Lucky, hard work, just trying to pull together community response, government leadership, the whole thing. It just how it materialized. I'm still absolutely baffled, but also have admiration for everyone and anyone. And that's one thing I did find about. I don't know what it was like in New Zealand, but certainly here in Victoria, the COVID story was more of a story of like Victorians pulling together, and those cookers that constantly were rallying and marching through the city. People just looked at them like, what planet are you actually on? Like 98% of the Victorian population got vaccinated. Actions speak louder than words. People talk about a silent majority, like an overwhelming silent majority were like, yeah, it wasn't great. Would I rather that not be the case? No, but I'm glad we kind of got through it and we're on through the other side. And I'm thankful to your point, that my father or my relatives who were susceptible to it are alive today.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Well, there you go. On that note, Neale Jones, thank you so much, not just for today's podcast. Thank you for your contribution to our New Zealand election episodes throughout the year, because we've done probably 3 or 4 of them, maybe 5 of them actually. I appreciate your time, your insights. Never easy to come onto a show after a defeat, but I'm grateful for your contribution, your insights, and your honest reflections. And obviously, we want to see Labor get back into government in 3 years' time. We hope I can get you back on to talk about elections and how we're going to win next time.
Always happy to.
Cheers, mate.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.